We've seen a decent amount of the combat of Ashes of Creation with the melee showcase, the ranger, cleric, tank, and mage reveals, and the Cyclops raid boss. I think the combat direction is pretty clear, and despite having made several videos on the combat already, I felt a comprehensive breakdown of what we have seen for the combat so far might be a good idea. To me, the MMO that has combat most similar to what Ashes appears to be going for is Guild Wars 2. There are also quite a few inspirations from ArcheAge in the combat system, and even some inspiration from pure action combat MMOs in terms of things like the active blocking and dodging. Ashes combat to me leans more to tab target than it does action, similar again to Guild Wars 2. Before we started seeing the combat, there was some confusion about what they meant by hybrid combat. Now it seems clear to me that they're going for a Guild Wars 2 version of hybrid combat. There's an action camera mode that works very similarly to Guild Wars 2, and like Guild Wars 2 seems to be the less optimal way to play, and really not that different fundamentally versus just staying in the tab camera mode. Action-based skills are template skills in which you see the template preview of where the skill will land. This seems to work in a very similar manner in both Ashes of Creation and Guild Wars. With combat being most similar to Guild Wars 2, what I want to do is run down the list of features of Guild Wars 2 combat and compare it to what we have seen in Ashes of Creation so far. In Guild Wars 2, you can cast your spells and abilities without a target. This doesn't always have a gameplay effect, but there are cases where it can be useful. For instance, a warrior leap ability that normally might need a target in other games like WoW can be used as a gap closer or escape even without being in range of your target. This to me feels better overall than the rigid nature of forcing targets to use skills. From what we have seen so far, Ashes seems to be very close, if not exactly the same in terms of being able to use abilities without a target. In Guild Wars 2, there are projectile drop-off physics at very long ranges. This rarely has any gameplay effects. Sometimes in World vs. World, when shooting players on top of walls, it can come into play, but other than that is more of an aesthetic than anything else. For Ashes, while we have no official word on whether projectile drop-off is a thing, I've seen what might be a projectile drop-off in a few of the gameplay videos. You can see it most clearly in the Cyclops raid boss fight. In Guild Wars 2, there is projectile collision. Ashes of Creation also has projectile collision. This is a big thing as it adds a lot of layers to the combat. For one, while this is more of a tab target game, other enemy players or mobs can step in front of your projectiles to take the damage instead of the tabbed target. This alone makes tanks much more useful in PvP, especially with active blocking being a thing, which we'll get into shortly. Another similarity to Guild Wars 2 combat is that as of now, Ashes does have a universal dodge roll system. In Guild Wars 2, when you dodge, you are invulnerable for the duration of the dodge. Dodge also has its own resource tied to it called Endurance, which in essence allowed you 2 dodges before you have to wait for your endurance meter to fill. In Ashes of Creation, the dodge is still not fully implemented. In the recent combat showcases, it was not tied to a resource, and the developers have confirmed that dodge will not be an iframe like it is in Guild Wars 2. However, they have talked about dodges potentially increasing certain defensive stats for a set time during or maybe even after dodging. They're talking about tying dodge and other universal skills like active blocking to a resource system eventually. But do not be surprised if it ends up being like ArcheAge, where everything was tied to mana and every class used mana, as that is how it was in Alpha 1 for Ashes of Creation, and so far every single class uses mana in the Alpha 2 showcases. Ashes constantly borrows from ArcheAge, even down to very small details like how the mounts side strafe very slowly. I definitely hope they make dodge and block utilize a different resource like stamina instead of mana, and they do seem to be leaning that way, but we have yet to see it. Similarly to projectile collision, there is also player collision in Ashes of Creation. Now, Guild Wars 2 actually did not have character model collision except in PvP when both players were targeting each other. Other than that, there was no collision. Ashes is kind of completely different in this regard. Both friendly players and enemy players have collision. Now, the enemy player collision I think adds a lot to PvP especially, and again allows tanks to block choke points and those sort of things, which I think add a major dynamic to PvP, especially especially the sieges. But the friendly player collision, I have said quite a few times I'm not a huge fan of, and the reason that it exists is as an AoE cap for friendly heal, like AoE heals and AoE buffing type spells. And as I've said before, there are much better ways to do that. But that's not the point of this video, to get into solutions to things we haven't even seen yet. So for now, let's just see how it works in Alpha 2 and go from there. Another area Ashes is similar to Guild Wars 2 combat is in the skill combo system, which Ashes has called player synergies. However, the combo system in Ashes is implemented much differently and is almost a direct copy of how Arcage handled combos. In Arcage, some skills could affect a combo based on what status effects are on the target. So if the distress status effect is on a target, you can use a skill that will promote that status effect to a stun. Some combos were just base damage increases in Arcage. So far, the combos in Ashes just promote debuffs to a more powerful debuff similar to the promotion seen in Arcage. We have seen a few combos. The first we saw was the fighter archetype applying a stun with Whirlwind, and then Cleric promotes the stagger to a stun with Chains of Restraint. In the Mage Showcase, we saw several synergies that could be applied by one class using a combination of skills. See my video on the Mage Showcase for all the synergies that we saw. Another similarity to Guild Wars 2 combat is that there's mounted combat. Now, Ashes mounted combat seems to look very similar on paper, yet again, to Arcage, but we haven't seen the mounted skills yet for Ashes. All we saw in Alpha 1 was a mount sprint ability, but if you read up on the mounted combat skills for Ashes that they have proposed, there are many similarities to Arcage mount skills. In addition to having mount skills, your mount is just like in Arcage in that it has its own separate health bar, and if you get knocked off your mount, it will still exist in the world and can be killed. Another similarity for now is that both Ashes and Guild Wars 2 have no global cooldown, though Ashes is potentially going to experiment with some skills being on a global cooldown in Alpha 2. No global cooldown can be a good thing if done correctly, however some MMOs, specifically Arcage, had major issues with no GCD, and that lower ping would cause you to do a lot more damage than does with higher ping. So hopefully Intrepid is aware of this potential issue and will implement this correctly. Next, let's talk about some areas that Ashes combat is different from Guild Wars 2. In Guild Wars 2, your weapon choice changes your first 5 skills. There are some limitations on what weapons are usable on each class. In Ashes, that is not the case. The skills on your bars are based on your class choice in Ashes. The weapons do not affect that at all. The weapons themselves do not have skills per se, but they essentially have what is called a combat animation montage for each weapon. This animation montage is the same no matter what class uses the weapon, and in Ashes every class can use every weapon. This combat animation montage is a series of varying weapon attacks that have different animations, attack radiuses, and procs based on where you are in the chain. Some steps of the chain might apply status conditions to the target, which players can then use a skill in their class kit to promote to a stronger status effect via the skill combo system. I noticed in Alpha 1 that weapons would have different lengths for this animation montage. Some weapons the chain was 3 animations long, some were 4, and some were as long as 5. We also found out during the Melee Combat Showcase last year that this animation montage can change based on the movement of the character, which was especially noticeable with the double daggers, as when moving forward or standing still, the animation montage is a left dagger attack, right dagger attack, and then both in a wide arc. When moving backwards, the last animation switches to an overhead attack. The speed of these animations varies based on the weapon as well, with daggers naturally being much faster than the greatsword, for instance. This entire system is borrowed to some extent from Arcage, in that every class can also use every weapon in Arcage. However, the weapon attacks were not as important as they seem to be in Ashes. In essence, this system replaces the auto attack system seen in a lot of tab target MMOs. Ashes will not have tab target. Instead, to use these weapon attacks, you will have to hold down the button, which is defaulted to Q, to use them. In addition, there is also a weapon skill tree that is separate from the class skill tree. They've also said that some weapons might work better for some classes as well. Another difference from Guild Wars 2 combat is Ashes is planning to have a universal active block system that players can use. Shields will naturally block more than other weapons, and melee weapons can active block. However, ranged weapons cannot active block. This is not fully implemented yet in Ashes, so we don't know much about it yet, and so so far, it is not even tied to a resource or cooldown of any kind. So there's a lot we don't know about active blocking, but this is a big area. It is different from Guild Wars 2. Another difference from Guild Wars 2 combat, and I think one of the ways that Ashes is trying to improve upon that formula, is with the floatiness that Guild Wars 2 combat had. In Guild Wars 2, it didn't matter what weapon you used, you could move freely while attacking, which can feel floaty. Ashes is using a split body root motion in which you can still move while using weapons and abilities, but there is some rooting that varies based on the weapon. For example, the dagger roots very little compared to the greatsword. Some very powerful skills in Ashes will fully root, but most of them will still allow some movement while casting, though the amount of rooting will vary again by the skill. Another difference is Guild Wars 2 did not have a sprinting mechanic, and Ashes does. Sprinting is not permitted in combat in Ashes, however. Another difference is Guild Wars 2 had a lot of iframes. Dodge was one, but there are a ton of skills that had iframes. Ashes is said to not have a lot of iframes. Another difference is Guild Wars 2 had a number of different class and universal resources. While so far for Ashes, all we have seen is the arcade style health and mana for everything, though they have talked about adding a stamina type of resource. And of course, a major difference is Ashes has a holy trinity and no downstate like Guild Wars 2. With the full rundown of the combat done and how the combat compares to Guild Wars 2 and Arcade, I do want to talk about a few unanswered questions I have regarding the combat. I'm going to add these to my website of unanswered questions that I have for Ashes. The first one is on the lack of a global cooldown, and if they're testing to ensure that ping differences will not affect DPS, to avoid the same issues we saw in Arcade. The second is the skill point system and whether this statement still holds true, and that players can choose to go wide and get a number of different skills or go deep into a few specific abilities. The next question I have is in regards to hybrid combat. Before the recent combat showcases, it was unsure what they meant by hybrid combat. Now it is fairly clear that this form of hybrid combat is very similar to Guild Wars 2, which leans much more into tab than action. With that in mind, in the past, it was said that tab skills can be switched to action skills. Ranger Airstrike ability or the Mage Ball Lightning ability, which are more of an action ability. I wonder how these could be turned into a tab skill, or how some of these tab abilities we have seen could be turned into a templated action ability. The next question I have is on the hard cap they have talked about in regards to action or tab skills. Before they said you could only slot 75% of your action bar with action skills or with tab skills. I wonder if this is still the case, and even the wiki has moved this into the not recently confirmed category. Another thing in that category is that hard CCs would be on action abilities and soft CCs would be on tab abilities. So far the only hard CCs we have seen were only achievable via combos, and they were also on the templated abilities. So it is possible this is still the case. I also want to know more about the time to kill. In the past, it was stated that the time to kill in the MMO would be 30 seconds to 1 minute if two players were just hitting each other and not using any defensives. However, this quote came from clear back in the Apocalypse days, so I wonder about this one for sure. For me, having a time to kill that long might make outplay potential very difficult, which is something I've always enjoyed in PvP MMOs. Those rare moments when you're able to successfully win an outmatch fight, 1v2 or 1v3 or more. With a time to kill that long, I am not sure those will be very frequent. But we do know that they're going for rock, paper, scissors balance, so if you're facing multiple classes that your class has a clear advantage against, you might still have that chance for some outplay potential. And the final question, I do wonder about the drop-off physics and whether that is a thing for the projectiles in Ashes of Creation. And that's all I have for the questions currently. As I've said a few times, I like the direction of combat, as I found Guild Wars 2 combat to be some of the best combat we have seen. Ashes looks to be improving on that combat system from what I can tell so far. I do apologize for the length of the video. I always try to keep my videos as short as possible, but there was a lot to go over in this one. With that in mind, thank you for watching to the end, and I'll see you guys in the next video.